Hey, welcome back to another experimental live read from Adult Brain. I'm Graham, one of the narrators. This is Ragnarok, The Age of Fire and Gravel. It's a book that was published by Ignatius Donnelly in 1883. So I've been reading it all week. If you want to start from the beginning, you can go back onto our live tab and see. But this week is part 3, The Legends, chapter 1 and 2. So the nature of myths and did man exist before the drift? So pretty interesting, a bunch of scientific references in here, and it's interesting to wonder about what has changed, what science has changed since then. Because pretty interesting discussions in the 1800s about what happened with this catastrophe. So please, yeah, smash the like button and subscribe and stuff. And we are just sort of doing an experiment here because we're recording the video with the pictures in the book and stuff like that as I read it. So this is rough and raw. I'll be editing it as I go. Hopefully, I didn't get a chance to pre-check too many pronunciations, so hopefully I don't have too many delays with pronunciation. So I will share the screen now, the beginning of this, and we'll get into it right away. I'll try not to cough and sputter and snort like I usually do. Part 3, The Legends, Chapter 1, The Nature of Myths. In a primitive people, the mind of one generation precisely repeats the minds of all former generations. The construction of the intellectual nature varies no more from age to age than the form of the body or the color of the skin. The generations feel the same emotions and think the same thoughts and use the same expressions. And this is to be expected, for the brain is as much a part of the inheritable material organization as the color of the eyes or the shape of the nose. The minds of men move automatically. No man thinks because he intends to think. He thinks as he hungers and thirsts under a great primal necessity. His thoughts come out from the inner depths of his being as the flowers developed by forces rising through the roots of the plant. The female bird says to herself, "The time is propitious, and now of..." Let's expand this out here, and I will start that again. The time propitious, propitious, propitious. The time is propitious, and now, of my own free will, and under the operation of my individual judgment, I will lay a nest full of eggs and hatch a brood of children. But it is unconscious that it is moved by a physical necessity, which has constrained all its ancestors from the beginning of time, and which will constrain all its posterity to the end of time. That its will is nothing more than an check. That its will is nothing more than an expression of age, development, sunlight, food, and the sky influences. If it were otherwise, it would be in the power of a generation to arrest the life of a race. All great thoughts are inspirations of God. They are part of the mechanism by which he advances the race. They are new varieties created out of old genera. There come bursts of creative force in history when great thoughts are born, and then again Brahma, as the Hindus say, goes to sleep for ages. But when the fever of creation comes, the poet, the inventor, or the philosopher can no more arrest the development of his own thoughts than the female bird, by her willpower, can stop the growth of the ova within her, or arrest the fever in the blood which forces her to incubation. The man who wrote the Shakespeare plays recognized this involuntary operation of even his own transcendent intellect when he said, "Our poesy is a gum which oozes from whence 'tis nourished." It came as the Arabian tree distilled its medicinal gum. It was the mere expression of an internal force, as much beyond his control as the production of the gum was beyond the control of the tree. But in primitive races, mind repeats mind for thousands of years. If a tale is told at 1,000,000 hearth fires, the probabilities are small indeed that any innovation at one hearth fire, however ingenious, will work its way into and modify the narration at all the rest. There's no printing press to make the thoughts of one man the thoughts of thousands. While the innovator is modifying the tale to his own satisfaction, to his immediate circle of hearers, the narrative is being repeated in its unchanged form at all the rest. Check, check. The doctrine of chances is against innovation. The majority rules. When, however, a marvelous tale is told to the new generation, to the little ones sitting around with open eyes and gaping mouths, they naturally ask, where did all this occur? The narrator must satisfy this curiosity, and so he replies, on yonder mountain top, or in yonder cave. The story has come down without its geography, and a new geography is given it. Again, an ancient word or name may have a significance in the language in which the story is told, different from that which it possessed in the original dialect. And in the effort to make the old fact and the new language harmonize, the storyteller is forced gradually to modify the narrative. And as this lingual difficulty occurs at every fireside, at every telling, an ingenious explanation comes at last to be generally accepted, and the ancient myth remains dressed in a new suit of linguistic clothes. But, as a rule, simple races repeat. They do not invent. 100 years ago, the highest faith was placed in written history, while the utmost contempt was felt for all legends. Whatever had been written down was regarded as certainly true. Whatever had not been written down was necessarily false. We are reminded of the We are reminded of that intellectual old brute Dr. Samuel Johnson trampling poor Macpherson underfoot, like an enraged elephant for daring to say that he had collected from the mountaineers of wild Scotland the poems of Ossian, and that they had been transmitted from mouth to mouth through ages. But the great epic of the son of Fingal will survive, part of the widening heritage of humanity, while Johnson is remembered only as a coarse-souled, ill-mannered incident in the development of... Let me redo that one here. Check, check, check. But the great epic of the son of Fingal will survive, part of the widening heritage of humanity, while Johnson is remembered only as a coarse-souled, ill-mannered incident in the development of the great English people. But as time rolled on, it was seen that the greater part of history was simply recorded legends, while all the rest represented the passions of factions, the hates of sects, or the servility and venality of historians. Men perceived that the common belief of antiquity, as expressed in universal tradition, was much more likely to be true than the written opinions of a few prejudiced individuals. And then grave and able men, philosophers, scientists, were seen with notebooks and pencils going out into Hindu villages, into German cottages, into Highland huts, into Indian teepees, in short, into all lands, taking down with the utmost care, accuracy, and respect the fairy stories, myths, and legends of the people, as repeated by old peasant women, the knitters in the sun, or by grey-haired warriors famous for fights. And when they came to put these narratives in due form, and as it were in parallel columns, it became apparent that they threw great floods of light upon the history of the world, and especially upon the question of the unity of the race. They proved that all the nations were repeating the same stories, in some cases in almost identical words, just as their ancestors had heard them in some most ancient land, in the dark background and absence of time, when the progenitors of the German, Gaul, Gael, Greek, Roman, Hindu, Persian, Egyptian, Arabian, and the red people of America dwelt together under the same roof tree and used the same language. But, above all, These legends prove the absolute fidelity of the memory of the races. We are told that the bridge piles driven by the Romans 2,000 years ago in the rivers of Europe, from which the surrounding waters have excluded the decaying atmosphere, have remained altogether unchanged in their condition. If this has been the case for 2,000 years, why would they not remain unchanged for 10,000, for 100,000 years? If the ice in which that Siberian mammoth was encased had preserved it intact for 100 years, if the ice if the ice in which that Siberian check, check. If the ice in which that Siberian mammoth was encased had preserved it intact for 100 years or 1,000 years, why might it not have preserved it for 10,000, for 100,000 years? Place a universal legend in the minds of a race, let them repeat it from generation to generation, and time ceases to be an element in the problem. Legend has one great foe to its perpetuation: civilization. Civilization brings with it a contempt for everything which it cannot understand. Skepticism becomes the synonym for intelligence. Men no longer repeat, they doubt, they dissect, they sneer, they reject, they invent. If the myth survives this treatment, the poets take it up and make it their stock in trade. They decorate it in a masquerade of frippery and finery, feathers and furbelows, like a clown dressed for a fancy ball. And the poor barbarian legend survives at last, if it survives at all, like the conflagration in Ovid or King Arthur in Tennyson, a hippopotamus smothered in flowers, jewels, and laces. Hence, we find the legends of the primitive American Indians adhering quite closely to the events of the past, while the myths that survive at all along the hence we find check. Hello to people watching. It's nice to see some of you, or all of you. Hence, we find the legends of the primitive American Indians adhering quite closely to the events of the past, while the myths that survive at all among the civilized nations of Europe are found in garbled forms and only among the peasantry of remote districts. In the future, more and more attention will be given to the myths of primitive races. They will be accounted as more reliable and as reaching farther back in time than many things which we call history. Thoughtful men will analyze them, despising nothing, like a chemist who resolves some compound object into its original elements, the very combination constituting a history of the object. H. Bancroft describes myths as a mass of fragmentary truth and fiction not open to rationalistic criticism, a partition wall of allegories built of dead facts cemented with wild fancies. It looms ever between the immeasurable and the measurable past. But he adds, never was there a time in the history of philosophy when the character, customs, and beliefs of aboriginal man and everything appertaining to him were held in such high esteem by scholars as at present. It is now recognized It is now a recognized principle of philosophy that no religious belief, however crude, nor any historical tradition, however absurd, can be held by the majority of a people for any considerable time as true without having had in the beginning some foundation in fact. And universal myth points to two conclusions. First, that is based on some fact. And universal myth points to two conclusions. First, that it is based on some fact. Secondly, that it Secondly, that it dates back in all probability to the time when the ancestors of the races possessing it had not yet separated. A myth should be analyzed carefully. The fungi that have attached themselves to it should be brushed off. The core of fact should be separated from the decorations and errors of tradition. But above all, it must be remembered that we cannot depend upon either the geography or the chronology of a myth. As I have shown, there is a universal tendency to give an old story a new habitat, and hence we have Ararats and Olympuses all over the world. In the same way, the myth is always brought down and attached to more recent events. All over Europe, in Germany, France, Spain, Switzerland, England, Scotland, Ireland, the exploits of the oldest mythological heroes figuring in the sagas, the Eddas, and Nibelungen. The exploits. Check. The exploits of the oldest mythological heroes figuring in the sagas, Eddas, and Nibelungen lied have been ascribed in the folklore and ballads of the people to Barbarossa, Charlemagne, Bobadil, Charles V, William Tell, Arthur, Robin Hood, Wallace, and St. Patrick. In the next place, we must remember how impossible it is for the mind to invent an entirely new fact. What dramatist or novelist has ever yet made a plot which did not consist of events that had already transpired somewhere on Earth? He must intensify events, concentrate and combine them or amplify them. But that is all. Men in all ages have suffered from jealousy, like Othello, have committed murders, like Macbeth, have yielded to the sway of morbid minds, like Hamlet, have stolen, lied, and debauched, like Falstaff. There are Oliver Twists, Bill Sykeses, and Nancys, Micawbers, Pickwicks, and Pecksniffs in every great city. There is nothing in the mind of man that has not pre-existed in nature. Can we imagine a person who never saw or heard of an elephant drawing a picture of such a two-tailed creature? It was thought at one time that man had made the flying dragon out of his own imagination. But we know now that the image of the pterodactyl has simply descended from generation to generation. Sinbad's great bird, the roc, was considered a flight of the Oriental fancy until science revealed the bones of the Dinornis. All the winged beasts breathing fire are simply a recollection of the comet. In fact, even with the patterns of nature before it, the human mind has not greatly exaggerated them. It has never drawn a bird larger than the Dinornis. Check. It has never drawn a bird larger than the Dinornis or a beast greater than the mammoth. It is utterly impossible that the races of the whole world, of all the continents and islands, could have preserved traditions from the most remote ages of a comet having struck the earth, of the great heat, the conflagration, the cave life, the age of darkness, and the return of the sun, and yet these things have had no basis of fact. It was not possible for the primitive mind to have imagined these things if they had never occurred. Chapter 2. Did man exist before the drift? First, let us ask ourselves this question. Did man exist before the drift? If he did, he must have survived it, and he could hardly have passed through it without some remembrance of such a terrible event surviving in the traditions of the race. If he did not exist before the drift, of course no myths descriptive of it could have come down to us. This preliminary question must then be settled by testimony. Let us call our witnesses. The Paleolithic hunter of the mid and late Pliocene river deposits in Europe belongs, as we have already shown, to a fauna which arrived in Britain before the lowering of the temperature produced glaciers and icebergs in our country. He may, therefore, be viewed as being probably preglacial. Man had spread widely over the earth before the drift. Therefore, he had lived long on the earth. His remains have been found in Scotland, England, Ireland, France, Spain, Italy, Greece, in Africa, in Palestine, in India, and in the United States. Man was living in the valley of the lower Thames before the Arctic mammalia had taken full possession of the valley of the Thames and before the big-nosed rhinoceros had become extinct. Mr. Titterman writes that among a number of bones obtained during the exploration of the Victoria Cave near Settle, Yorkshire, there is one which Mr. Busk has identified as human. Mr. Busk says, "The bone is, I have no doubt, human, a portion of an unusually clumsy fibula, and in that respect not unlike the same bone in the Menton skeleton. The deposit from which the bone was obtained is overlaid by a bed of stiff glacial clay containing ice-scratched boulders. Here, then, says Geeky, is direct proof that men lived in England prior to the last interglacial period. The evidences are numerous, as I have shown, that when these deposits came upon the earth, the face of the land was above the sea, and occupied by plants and animals." Here's a section at St. Echule. The accompanying cut, taken from Sir John Lubbock's Prehistoric Times, page 364, represents the strata at Saint-Achille, near Amiens, in France. The upper stratum A represents a brick earth, 4 to 5 feet in thickness, and containing a few angular flints. The next B is a thin layer of angular gravel, 1 to 2 feet in thickness. The next C is a bed of sandy marl, far. The next C is a bed of sandy marl, 5 to 6. Why can't I say that? The next C is a bed of sandy marl, 5 to 6 feet in thickness. The lowest deposit, D, immediately overlies the chalk. It is a bed of partially rounded gravel, and in this, human implements of flint have been found. Right there, huh? Check. The spot was used in the early Christian period as a cemetery. F represents one of the graves made 1,500 years ago. E represents one of the ancient coffins, of which only the nails and clamps are left, every particle of the wood having perished. And says Sir John Lubbock, "It is especially at the lower part of these lowest deposits that the flint implements occur. The bones of the mammoth, the wild bull, the deer, the horse, the rhinoceros, and the reindeer are found near the bottom of these strata mixed with the flint implements of men. All the fossils belong to animals which live on land. We find no marine remains. Remember that the drift is unfalciferous and unstratified, that it fell en masse, and that these remains are found in its lower part, or caught between it and the rocks below it, and you can form a vivid picture of the sudden and terrible catastrophe. The trees were embedded with man and the animals. The bones of men, smaller and more friable, probably perished, ground up in the tempest, while only their flint implements and the great bones of the larger animals, hard as stones, remained to tell the dreadful story. And yet, some human bones have been found. A lower jawbone was discovered in a pit in Moulin-Guinon. Oh boy. Moulin-Guignon. Guinon. I better check the pronunciation of that guy. Sorry, this will just be a sec here. I'm gonna go to my assistant. My guess is Moulin-Guinon. Moulin-Guignon. Moulin-Guignon. Moulin. Moulin-Guignon. Moulin-Guignon. Guignon. Oh boy. A lower jawbone was discovered in a pit at Moulin-Guignon, and a skull and other bones were found in the valley of the Seine by Monsieur Bertrand. And these discoveries have not been limited to river gravels. In the Shrub Hill gravel bed in England, in the lowest part of it, numerous flint implements of the Paleolithic type have been discovered. We have, besides these sub-drift remains, the skulls of men who probably lived before the great cataclysm, men who may have looked upon the very comet that smote the world. They represent two widely different races. One is the Ingus. Ingus. Check. One is the Ingus skull, so called from the cave of Ingus near Liege, where it was found by Dr. Schmerling. It is a fair average human skull which might, says Huxley, have belonged to a philosopher or might have contained the thoughtless brains of a savage. Oh. Or might have contained the thoughtless brains of a savage. Oh, that's not very nice, Huxley. Have belonged to a... Oh boy. And then I went and fucked it up, so I got to re-say it. Excuse my language. Have belonged to a philosopher or might have contained the thoughtless brains of a savage. It represents a civilized, if not a cultivated race of men. There's the Ingus skull right there. Huh. It may represent a victim, a prisoner held for a cannibalistic feast, or a traitor from a more civilized region. In another cave, in the Neanderthal near Hochdahl, between Dusseldorf and Elberfeld, a skull was found which is most ape-like of all known human crania. The man to whom it belonged must have been a barbarian brute of the rudest possible type. Here is a representation of it. There it is, the Neanderthal skull. I beg the reader to remember these skulls when he comes to read a little further on the legend told by an American Indian tribe of California, describing the marriage between the daughter of the gods and a son of the grizzly bears, from which union, we are told, came the Indian tribes. These skulls represent creatures as far apart, I was about to say, as gods and bears. The Ingus skull, with its full frontal brain pan, its fine lines, and its splendidly arched dome, tells us of ages of cultivation and development in some favored center of the race, while the horrible and beast-like proportions of the Neanderthal skull speak with no less certainty of undeveloped, brutal, savage man, only a little above the gorilla in capacity, a prowler, a robber, a murderer, a cave dweller, a cannibal, a Cain. We shall see as we go on in the legends of the races on both sides of the Atlantic that they all look to some central land east of America and west of Europe, some island of the ocean where dwelt a godlike race and where alone it would seem the human race was preserved to repeople the earth. While these brutal representatives of the race, the Neanderthal people, were crushed out. And this is not mere theorizing. It is conceded, as the result of most extensive scientific research, one, that the great southern mammalia perished in One, that the great southern mammalia perished in Europe when the drift came upon the earth. Two, it is conceded that these two skulls are associated with the bones of these locally extinct animals, mingled together in the same deposits. Three, the conclusion is therefore logically irresistible that these skulls belong to men who lived during or before the drift age. Many authorities support this proposition that man, Paleolithic man, man of the mammoth, and the mastodon existed in the caves of Europe before the drift. After having occupied the English caves for untold ages, Paleolithic man disappeared forever, and with him vanished many animals now either locally or wholly extinct. Above the remains of man in these caves comes a deposit of stalagmite 12 feet in thickness, indicating a vast period of time which it was being formed, and during this time, man was absent. Above this stalagmite comes another deposit of cave earth. The deposits immediately overlying the stalagmite and cave earth contain an almost totally different assemblage of animal remains. Excuse me. I have to redo that. The deposit. The deposits immediately overlying the stalagmite and cave earth contain an almost totally different assemblage of animal remains, along with relics of the Neolithic, Bronze, Iron, and Historic periods. There is no passage, but, on the contrary, a sharp and abrupt break between these later deposits and the underlying Paleolithic accumulations. Here we have the proof that man inhabited these caves for ages before the drift, that he perished with the great mammals and disappeared, and that the 12 feet of stalagmite were formed while no men and few animals dwelt in Europe. But some fragment of the human race had escaped elsewhere in some other region. There it multiplied and replenished the earth and gradually extended and spread again over Europe and reappeared in the cave deposits above the stalagmite. And in like manner, the animals gradually came in from the regions on which the drift had not fallen. But the revelations of the last few years prove not only that man lived during the drift age and that he dwelt on the earth when the drift fell, but that he can be traced backward for ages before the drift, and that he was contemporary with species of great animals that had run their course and ceased to exist centuries, perhaps thousands of years before the drift. I quote a high authority. Most of the human relics of any sort have been found in the more recent layers of the drift. They have been discovered, however, not only in the older drift, but also, though very rarely, in the underlying tertiary. For instance, in the upper Pliocene at St. Prest, near Chartres, were found stone implements and cuttings on bone in connection with relics of a long extinct elephant, Elephas meridionalis, that is wholly lacking in the drift. During the past 2 years, the evidences of human existence in the tertiary period, i.e., previous to the age of mammoths in the diluvial period, have multiplied and by their multiplication give cumulative confirmation to each other. Even in the lower strata of the Miocene, the middle tertiary, important discoveries of stone knives and bone cuttings have been made, as at Thenay, Denouement, de Marne and Loire. Marne et Loire. Marne et Loire. Allier, France. Okay, all these French towns and cities. Discoveries of stone knives and bone cuttings have been made. Important discoveries of stone knives and bone cuttings have been made, as at Thenay, Department of Marne et Loire, and Billy, Department of Allier, France. Professor J.D. Whitney, the eminent state geologist of California, reports similar discoveries there also. So then, we may believe that before the last great upheaval of the Alps and Pyrenees, and while the yet luxuriant vegetation of the gotta redo that guy. This is rough and raw. My leg is asleep. Aw, thanks for the note there, Sunny D. That is amazing to hear. Uh-oh, did I delete this whole thing? What's going on here? Similar discoveries there also. All right, let's see. Where am I at now? My foot's I'm gonna get pins and needles in my leg here. There we are. That's got to read this whole sentence again. So then we may believe that before the last great upheaval of the Alps and Pyrenees, and while a yet luxuriant vegetation of the then, i.e., in the tertiary period, paradisiac climate yet adorned Central Europe, man inhabited this region. We turn to the American continent and we find additional proofs of man's pre-glacial existence. The American nationalist, oops, what a weird Freudian slip there. The American naturalist. The American naturalist, 1873, says the discoveries are the discoveries that are constantly being made in this country are proving that man existed on this continent as far back in geological time as on the European continent. And it even seems that America, really the old world geologically, will soon prove to be the birthplace of the earliest race of man. One of the late and important discoveries is that by Mr. E.L. Berthoud, which is given in full with a map in the Proceedings of the Philadelphia Academy of Sciences for 1872, page 46. Mr. Berthoud there reports the discovery of ancient fireplaces, rude stone monuments, and implements of stone in great number and variety in several places along Crow Creek in Colorado and also on several other rivers in the vicinity. These fireplaces indicate several ancient sites of an unknown race differing entirely from the mound builders and the present Indians, while the shells and other fossils found with the remains make it quite certain that the deposit in which the ancient sites are found is as old as the Pliocene and perhaps as the Miocene. And this is all written in 1883. Interesting narratives from back then. Check. As the fossil shells found with the relics of man. Somebody's phoning me. Sorry about that. There's an important meeting later. How much do I have left here? Not much. Couple pages, almost done. As the Miocene. Check. As the fossil shells found with the relics of man are of estuary forms, and as the sites of the ancient towns are on extended points of land, and at the base of the ridges or bluffs, Mr. Berthoud thinks the evidence is strongly in favor of the locations having been near some ancient freshwater lake, whose vestiges the present topography in the region favors. Excuse my language. I have to redo that whole thing. I messed it up at the end. I'm trying to be as picky as an editor here. Actually, I can just do that. As the fossil shells found with the relics of man are of estuary forms, and as the sites of the ancient towns are on the extended points of land, and at the base of the ridges or bluffs, Mr. Berthoud thinks the evidence is strongly in favor of the locations having been near some ancient freshwater lake, whose vestiges the present topography of the region favors. I quote the following from the Scientific American, 1880. The finding of numerous relics of a buried race on an ancient horizon from 20 to 30 feet below the present level of country in Missouri and Kansas has been noted. The St. Louis Republican gives particulars of another find of an unmistakable character made last spring, 1880, in Franklin County, Missouri, by Dr. R.W. Booth, who was engaged in iron mining about 3 miles from Dry Branch, a station on the St. Louis and San Fernando. Santa Fe Railroad, St. Louis or St. Louis? St. Louis. St. Louis? St. Louis. St. Louis. Why am I having a hard time with knowing what that is right now? St. Louis. Who was engaged in iron mining about 3. Oh boy. I'm gonna have to go all the way back here. Another redo. Getting excited towards the end of this chapter. Particulars of another find of an unmistakable character made last. Gives part. Okay, let's see here. St. Louis or St. Louis? St. Louis. The St. Louis Republican gives particulars. Whoa, why did that just jump up like that? Oh, that's weird. The record level just jumped up. The St. Louis Republican gives particulars. The St. Louis Republican gives particulars of another find of an unmistakable character made last spring, 1880, in Franklin County, Missouri, by Dr. R.W. Booth, who was engaged in iron mining about 3 miles from Dry Branch, a station on the St. Louis and Santa Fe Railroad. At a depth of 18 feet below the surface, the miners uncovered a human skull with portions of the ribs, vertebral column, and collarbone. With them were found 2 flint arrowheads of the most primitive type, imperfect in shape and barbed. A few pieces of charcoal were also found at the same time and place. Dr. Booth was fully aware of the importance of the discovery and tried to preserve everything found, but upon touching the skull, it crumbled to dust, and some of the other bones broke into small pieces and partly crumbled away. But enough was preserved to fully establish the fact that they are human bones. Some 15 or 20 days subsequent to the first finding, at a depth of 24 feet below the surface, other bones were found, a thigh bone and a portion of the vertebra, and several pieces of charred wood, the bones apparently belonging to the first found skeleton. In both cases, the bones rested on a fibrous stratum, suspected at the time to be a fragment of coarse matting. This lay upon a floor of soft but solid iron ore, which retained the imprint of the fibers. The indications are that the filled cavity had originally been a sort of cave, and that the supposed matting was more probably a layer of twigs, rushes, or weeds, which the inhabitants of the cave had used as a bed, as the fiber marks cross each other irregularly. The ore bed in which the remains were found, and part of which seems to have formed after the period of human occupation of the cave, lies in the second, or sacro, or saccharoidal, saccharoidal, excuse me, or saccharoidal sandstone of the Lower Silurian. Note the facts. The remains of this man are found separated. Part are 18 feet below the surface, part 24 feet. That is, they are 6 feet apart. How can we account for this condition of things except by supposing that the poor savage had rushed for safety to his shallow rock shelter, and had there been caught by the world tempest and torn to pieces, and deposited in fragments with the debris that filled his rude home? Nasty, nasty. The poor savage was torn apart. In California, we encounter a still more surprising state of things. The celebrated Calaveras? There's a picture there, plummet from San Joaquin Valley, California. In California, we encounter a still more surprising state of things. The celebrated Calaveras skull was found in a shaft 150 feet deep, under 5 beds of lava and volcanic tufa, and 4 beds of auriferous gravel. The accompanying cut represents a plummet found in digging a well in the San Joaquin Valley, California, 30 feet below the surface. Dr. Foster says, In examining this beautiful relic, one is led almost instinctively to believe that it was used as a plummet for the purpose of determining the perpendicular to the horizon. What? The plum. Plummet? Plummet? This is what they called? Foster says this is what they call it back then, a plummet. In examining this beautiful relic, one is led almost instinctively to believe that it was used as a plummet for the purpose of determining the perpendicular to the horizon. For building purposes? When we consider its symmetry of form, the contrast of colors brought out by the process of grinding and polishing, and the delicate drilling of the hole through a material, cinetic, cyanite. Check. Where's the hole in there? Oh, right at the top there. Huh. Like a plumb bob. So liable to fracture. Cyanite. So liable to fracture. We are free to say it affords an cyanite. So liable to fracture. We are free to say it affords an exhibition of the lapidary skill superior to anything yet furnished by the Stone Age of either continent. In Louisiana, layers of pottery, 6 inches thick, with remnants of matting and baskets, were found 12 feet below the surface and underneath what Dr. Foster believes to be the strata of the drift. I might fill pages with similar testimony, but I think I've given enough to satisfy the reader that man did exist before the drift. I shall discuss the subject still further when I come to consider in a subsequent chapter the question whether pre-glacial man was or was not civilized. That should be interesting. That's getting into like pre-cataclysm civilization. Should be interesting to see what they thought in 1883. Coming up next week, chapter 3 and 4. So chapter 3 is Legends of the Coming of the Comet. So that should be fun. Yeah, thanks for watching and listening. Like, smash that like button and subscribe and all that. And we will be back with some more experimental live reads of this Ragnarok next week. Thanks, everybody. Love you.